Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Mark Anthony's Music Picks. Today's episode 131, and I'm going to be working with a new concept that I haven't really touched on this channel yet up until this point. Today's episode is going to, ironically, be featuring West Coast house. And I say ironically because when I think of West Coast house, what I really think of is very cheery house music, very pure. And I think brightness. I think daytime parties. I think lots of people dancing and a very uplifting, optimistic, forward-looking vibe. When I particularly think of what I consider to be West Coast house, I think of the time period from about 1995 to about 2010, and there might be a little bit of wiggle room on the end of that, and specifically peaking around the year 2002 to 2004. I think that was like the absolute pinnacle of it. That's when the most releases were coming out, in my opinion. And one of the charming things about that era of West Coast house is that almost everything from there is on vinyl. So if you like that flavor of house music and you're a vinyl head, it really lends itself. There's just not too many items that are coming from that genre that didn't get put to wax. It was like if it wasn't on wax, it wasn't credible, and it's like it didn't exist. And when I first said that it's ironic, I actually wanted to record this episode with nice daylight coming in to kind of accompany what I picture West Coast house to be, but we are now on 4 days straight of it raining here. Hurricane Ian came up the coast, and it's literally been dark and gloomy for 4 days straight, and I've been waiting to drop this episode, and I finally just gave up because I don't know, it might not stop raining for another couple days, and the show must go on. So I want to keep the channel going, and I have so many more ideas in the pipeline. I can't be camping out too long on these episodes. So West Coast house, it had a tendency for some reason to lean a little bit more commercial. You'll notice with some of the tracks that I talk about today and just your overall perception of it, you'll probably notice that it's very sample heavy, and it tends to sample hip hop, R&B, and funk. I don't know how those two things ended up melding together. Maybe it's all the pot smoke out there on the West Coast. I mean, hip hop and house and 70-degree highs. I think it might all lend itself to sort of blending together. So, a wonderful genre. I honestly don't know what happened to West Coast house after about 2010. I know that people still party out there. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there was this era with 10 or 15 kingpin producers in it, and they've all since gone quiet. And I guess EDM and festivals and people wearing bandanas across their face, I guess that took over. But I think most people, even the young people, would probably agree that the old scene was was a little bit better than what's going on out there now. But anyways, let's talk about some of the absolute champions from that era. And I can't talk about West Coast house without first getting right to it. Arguably, I would think the king of California in the late 90s and 2000s in the house scene, for the absolute purists out there, Mark Farina. Man, when I think of Mark Farina, first of all, I know he's from Chicago, so let me acknowledge that. But he moved to the West Coast at some point and affiliated himself with M.A.M.P Records, and he launched the absolutely epic Mushroom Jazz series. Mushroom Jazz has 8 releases in it total, spanning from 1995 to, I think the last one came out in 2016, and I haven't listened to all of them, but I think I've listened to 4 of them. I have the CDs, and I've absolutely rinsed them. I've mulched them to death. Really, really stellar music there. And Mark Farina was the only one that was really doing trip hop like that, or at least he brought it really to the masses. And it had the appeal of, like I said, a lot of samples, a lot of hip hop, a lot of R&B, and it crossed over with this deep, funky house that was really popular at the time. So I absolutely adore the Mushroom Jazz series. There's probably some people that would talk smack on it because it's not really underground, and it's kind of boutiquey in its own way. I mean, those mixes were really really done well. If you really listen to Mushroom Jazz, like take Mushroom Jazz 3, 4, or 5, you can tell that it was actually recorded by hand, right? Because there's every once in a while you can hear some of the drums are just a tiny bit off, but they get fixed, and you can hear that Mark actually recorded that himself. So I've always appreciated like the level of accuracy, the track selection, and just the novelty of the concept. You know, the Mushroom Jazz series, you put them in the car, and it kind of can become, you know, if you crank it up loud, it can become jamming, head bobbing music, or you can turn it down and let it be a little bit passive and have a conversation with it playing in the background, and it's really diverse for that. This here is Mark's Lost Baggage EP. This is probably my favorite EP of his, although I'm also a big fan of his original mix of Cali Spaces, which I'm still trying to acquire. This here samples very heavily, like I said, older like random hip hop and funk records are sampled in here, and each track in the Lost Baggage EP has 5 or 6 samples that are used in it. And I can't help but be reminded of the Philly producer, someone else, aka Sean O'Neill, that unfortunately passed away in 2020 during the pandemic. But he had his Found Sound label, and he had those 2 releases that he dropped in the very early stages of that label, the Rip It Cookie Monster EP and the Bedroom Eyes EP, and they both have a similar. It's like Mark and Sean O'Neill were sort of pulling from the same micro house inspiration, like because they had weird odd vocal samples coupled with really heavy kick drums and fat bass. So it was like kind of like an odd juxtaposition, but it lends itself. I think these are built for tight rooms with big sound systems. I don't mean like a portable outside makeshift sound system. I mean like a nightclub where the main floor only holds maybe 50 or 100 people, and it's relatively small in its space, and it relies not on big booming echoes and such, you know, cascading around the room. It's more of a let's get it down low. And Mark Farina's kick drums, I think, are reflective of the environments that he wanted to play in. In the track here that I'm featuring, it's called Talk to Me. Huge kick drum. Like when the kick drum comes in this, just imagine that on subs that are really compressing the air in the room and really just like almost like squeezing the air out of the room when the subs hit, and the bass lines are really fat and plasticky. It's just a really novel way to present house music and also keep the dance floor moving. So I really appreciate Mark for venturing out into this micro house territory, being, you know, arguably in the first wave of it, and bringing something that even now when I listen to this, what's it been, 2004, what's that, 18 years later, it still sounds fresh to me. Every track on here is good, and they are still totally relevant. Next up is another mainstay from M.A.M.P Records. This is Andy Caldwell. And I selected this because this record has survived repeated cullings in my record collection over the years. Every year or two I go through and I look to see if anything can be sold off, or if it hasn't aged well. I mean, sometimes I throw records out. I hate to admit it, but sometimes I do. You know, you can't, if something's not going to sell for $5 or more and you don't want it anymore, I mean, there's nothing really left to be done with it. So every once in a while I do get rid of records. But this old one from Andy Caldwell survived, and that's also saying a lot because it came out in 2005 and has a lot of the influences that came to be known as mainstream electro house in that era. Artists like Milo were doing Drop the Pressure, and a lot of the artists were using 8-bit video game sounds to construct melodies and hooks and leads in some of these tracks. A lot of it was over the top and went cheesy, but I think especially the electro records that tended to mix in with acid elements, I think the electro video game elements and the subtle acid that you'll hear in this, I think those two elements mixed together and created something that's like, okay, I can tell that's from 2005, but it's not something that you're like, oh boy, that gives me a headache, I can't even listen to it anymore. It's something that's still smooth, even though you can tell exactly when it's from. The vocal in here, the waiting game, it sounds like kind of a guy chasing a girl, and he's kind of feeling like he's aggressive, and he's eventually going to get her. Like, he's persistent and he's not going to give in. So I hope whoever wrote this song ended up getting the girl. And what a wonderful house vocal. In 2002, the Lawnchair Generals came onto the scene, based out of Seattle, and released arguably their biggest single in their entire catalog. Like I said, their catalog starts in 2002, and I think they ended up parting ways. It was Carlos and Peter. I think they parted ways in around 2015. But this is, I think, their most famous EP, and what a great one. I talked in the beginning of the episode about West Coast House leaning on hip-hop and R&B samples, and every track on this record has that. My featured track on here is the A-side, The One Thing. A few things to say about One Thing. I love the tech house. This is like peak tech house energy right here. Listen to when the bass line comes in this track. In the intro, like in the first 2 minutes, it's an absolute stormer of a bass line. I mean, this is for if your night goes from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. This is the one you want to play at like 1:15 or 1:30, because this is going to totally take the roof off. I also really adore how the sample was teased. I mean, it's a 7 or 8 minute track, and the sample of One Thing is teased for the entire record, and it doesn't actually come into full bloom until the very last verse, and that's when the track releases all of its pent-up energy. The sample One Thing actually comes from an 80s group. I'm a major 80s cheesehead. Although this group isn't cheesy, so I shouldn't call them cheese. The sample came from the Jets, and the track is called Rocket to You. So if you go and listen to that album, the Rocket to You is featured on their album that came out in 1987. So you'll be able to hear the source material for that. And everybody, it's like one of those familiar songs that if you grew up in the 80s, you knew Rock It To You. And it was just sort of one of those 80s songs that was like not like a #1 hit, but it was great and you knew it was timeless. So Lawnchair Generals just grabbed that sample, bring it forward into 2002, and just set off dance floors with it. I've always felt that West Coast house lends itself to boutiques that sell clothing. It always seemed like if you were walking into a high-end clothing store and everything was presented up on white shelves, you know, something like Armani Exchange or DKNY, you know, I used to go clothes shopping a lot more than I do now. My priorities have shifted as I've gotten older, but when I was in my 20s, I liked to dress well. So I spent a lot of time in stores like that, and I noticed that it was always this very uplifting, inoffensive house. And if you look at those track lists, almost all that stuff was coming from the West Coast around the year 2003, 2005. That's, I mean, they would even sell CDs of what was playing over the speakers at the registers. You could buy it when you checked out, and some of it was really good. So these tracks have that boutique-y sort of waiting in an elevator feeling to them, and I wanted to present this one to you. Now, I'll admit this is from a German artist. But if you didn't know that, if I told you that this was made in 2007 or 2008 by somebody in California, I think that would be totally plausible. The artist here is Ronald Kristoff, and his track is called Take Off Baby. I mean, what a weird, odd, and at the same time absolutely exhilarating record. I love listening to this. The intro with the random samples of an airplane, and it's like you're taking off in a little commercial airplane, like a little stubby one from a private airport, and the vocal that comes in with the guy ba-dum bum bum bum. I mean, you just can't beat that. In 1986, Steve Winwood, one of the most American-sounding artist names ever in history, released this track. This is his Back in the High Life, his breakout album that was played all over American radio in the late 80s, and rightfully so. This is 80s cheese, and I absolutely love it. I love this record, and he had a track on there that's well known, probably the second most popular song on here. The Higher Love was the breakout, the one that got hammered the most on the radio, but there was a kind of a second fiddle track that was called The Finer Things. And in the finer things, in the first verse, Steve sings a lyric, and we'll drink our cup of laughter. Now, I only know that because I Googled the lyrics to this song. It doesn't sound like drink our cup of laughter. It sounds like we'll praise ourselves for love, or something like that. I mean, it's one of those 80s lyrics where you see it in print and you're like, okay, I can see that those are the words and I believe you. But the way he sang that, it's almost like not fair. Were you trying to confuse me and have everybody singing the wrong words for decades and until the lyrics were actually revealed? But anyways, regarding that sample, Miguel Migs realized the beauty of the lyrics and dropped them into, I think, his biggest single ever, which is called Pedal Pushing. And Pedal Pushing was featured on the 24th Street Sounds compilation. Now, I don't have a lot of Miguel Migs records. I know that he's very well respected, and as far as boutique, commercial-leaning, crowd-friendly house goes, I think he really was up there with Farina in the early 2000s as, got to be in the top 5 for California. If you ask somebody from California, who are your favorite house DJs, 15 years ago, they would have said Miguel Migs would have been in there. But he drops Pedal Pushing, puts the Steve Winwood lyric in there, and basically rinses the sample for the whole track. Lots of uplifting sounds. Everything about it is like a bright sunny day crescendo. And before I get off this record, I just want to say there's another great track on here. If you check out this track listing, the Fred Everything on here, Next to Me vocal dub, that's really another great house track from this era. And the only reason I didn't feature it in this episode is because Fred Everything is from Quebec, Canada, and Quebec's on the east coast of Canada. So I couldn't even sort of make it seem like it was coming from the west coast of Canada and fit the episodes. So I didn't include it. But anyways, Miguel Migs, Pedal Pushing here. I really think his best-selling single ever, and rightfully so. All right, that's it for the West Coast episode. Stay tuned for part 2 coming at some point in the future. I hope you enjoyed these. And also, before I forget, let me know if that Miguel Migs 24th Street Sound, let me know if that CD itself, that was actually a double CD compilation. Let me know if any of you out there are familiar with it and if you would recommend it. Also, feel free to make recommendations down in the comments section. If there's anything in the realm of what I talked about today that reminds you of another record that you think is like an absolute must-have, I'm always down to add to the collection. And thank you to Miguel Migs, Mark Farina, the Lawnchair Generals, Andy Caldwell, and Ronald Kristoff. I really appreciate the music, and if you ever end up checking out this episode, I hope you enjoy it. Thank you, and take care.